So just want to reemphasize again what he was saying. I know that we got a little bit of feedback from security about the importance of pre-registering. So one more plug for that. Just make sure you go pre-register. I'll email out a link. It'll be the same Google form. And then we'll just use that, and also for your Wi-Fi. Okay, so today we have lined up 2 talks. The first one by Jeff Wilde, offline websites with PouchDB. And then afterwards we have Jeremy Lund, who's going to be presenting on harnessing the power of ng model and ng form. And then after that, we'll probably do some lightning talks and all that, but I'll just come up again after Jeremy's done. So if you're ready, Jeff, I think we could jump over, and hopefully this Adobe Connect thing works great for us, right, Brendan?
I don't know how I feel about being the first person to present in such a big room on big screens. I've also been a second-class citizen and a PC user my whole career. Switched to a MacBook a month ago, so trying to upgrade there. But I'm all thumbs, so if I mess up and I need help with my Mac, you have to call the answers, all right? Oh, shoot. I don't want to join the audio. All right, thanks. I don't know what's going on. We can just have you go right to the projector. Guess I'll just talk about me. I'm a development manager at Vivint Solar. Been there for a month. Kind of cool. The value proposition there is they go up and we say, free solar panels, you just agree to buy electricity for the next 20 years from us, and it's at a reduced rate. Like, for example, in Hawaii, the electricity that you purchase from your panels from Vivint Solar is half of what it costs to pull it from the grid. So you just go up and say, hey, would you like to pay half on your power bill? People say yes, and so it's going a lot. Vivint Solar is full-stack JavaScript, so it's Angular, Node, and then also we use CouchDB, which is a document store that's all JSON, and then you also query it with mapreduce and JavaScript functions. So it's kind of cool. We also have Elasticsearch built on top of that for some of our searching and stuff. Great culture, good environment, and I'm a big fan of full-stack JavaScript. My background is Microsoft, so I've done a lot of ASP.NET, and it's nice doing JavaScript end-to-end. I think it's great. Next, we're going to have to start singing, I guess. Any requests? Hey, there we go. All right, so let me give you a little background to why offline with PouchDB. My previous company, I've only been with Vivint Solar for 4 months, was with a company called IT International. They do trade shows. Sum it up, my main client was the Consumer Electronics Association. And we do the CS event that's coming up here in January. When you show up there, it's a distributed deployment. We need to be able to know who you are, register you at any number of the hotels, at the airport, all over the place. But a lot of these places, the network connectivity is not always up. So we have a disconnected scenario where we need to be able to print no matter what, have an offline cache, so you can print your badge, And then if we have connectivity, we need to sync up whatever changes you need. So the solution we came to that was using CouchDB backed with PouchDB. CouchDB is a document storage like MongoDB if you haven't used it. The cool thing with it is it does master-to-master replication. You can write a record at any node, and it'll sync up and everywhere. So you can have these offline deploys. Getting your, I'm going to talk over here because I can see my screen. Your HTML application offline is easy with HTML5 application cache. Just specify the manifest attributes on your HTML tag, and then any of the assets that you list in here will retrieve once, and it'll actually never retrieve them again. Anything that's under the cache manifest there. You notice it's got the hashtag and then the date there. You have to have that if you ever want to refresh it and have it do something else. You have to make a change to the manifest and save it, and then it'll go back out, re-grab all your assets once for you, and then never request them again. You see the network tag right there. Those are things that it won't cache, and it'll always rely on the network for. And the fallback is what it should do if it requests something on the network and it can't find it where it should go. So getting your HTML page to be offline is super simple with HTML5. You just say, hey, look, cache these assets and always get them. If you don't have a connection, or even if you do, it's always just going to serve up what I got last time. So that's great, except the problem with that is that you only get your static assets. You can have HTML, you can have your images, you can have your CSS, and they'll always come back up. That doesn't work well for data, though. If I have a data-intensive application and I need to either read data or save data and commit data, if I'm not offline, I'm not connected, and I'm depending on calling a web service, then it's just out of luck. You have to wait for the application to come back online. So this is where PouchDB comes in. Before we go to CouchDB, we're going to talk about CouchDB. So CouchDB runs as a service on your machine. It's actually the actual full database. I've already mentioned it's a document store. It's got a great REST interface. So you interact with it with put and post, delete, and get. Just those verbs, and request the documents you want. It actually is a web server. You can actually serve attachments and files. They have what they call couch apps. And you can technically have your database also be your web server because it's just going to talk HTTP and return whatever you need. I don't think that's typically recommended, or I didn't like that, but it can do that. And then it's got the master-master replication and then the conflict resolution. So if you have two CouchDB nodes that are in a disconnected state and you make the same change to the same document, it's not going to know, okay, who wins. So it can either put them on a conflicted state and you have a conflicted flag. You can query against those and have manual intervention, or you can have a conflict resolution strategy, such as, this one updated first name, the other one updated last name, let's just merge them. Or you can have a strategy such as whoever did it last wins and overwrites this. So you can either have a resolution strategy or you can have manual intervention. The thing with CouchDB is it follows the CAP theorem. The CAP theorem states that every database type can have one of three attributes. You can either have consistency across all your databases. You can have availability, so it's always up, always available. And you can have partition tolerance. So you can partition it across nodes easy. CouchDB falls from the part of the CAP theorem of high availability and partition tolerance. So it means that you're eventually consistent. Another way to say that is that I'm not guaranteed that every CouchDB instance at any given time is always going to be consistent. The replication, depending on your network availability, it's typically a sub-second, but there is a second there when you can do that. So high transaction, like, I don't know, if you're doing like a purchase site or an auction site, people need to bid, and you need that, that's not going to be a good fit. But for a distributed situation where for us, the data is different for a few seconds between here and there, it's not going to matter. That's much more important that we are always up, we always have data, and we can chop up our data and distribute it however we like. So that was the important situation there. Here you can see different things. So over here on the AP part of it, you can see you have Cassandra and CouchDB. You have more your traditional ones over here with Postgres and your traditional relational storage, which are going to favor consistency and availability, but the partitioning is much more difficult. The previous year at CES, we tried to use SQL Server replication, peer-to-peer replication. to solve this exact problem. And we would get an error in one of our database, and it would replicate that and take down the entire peer-to-peer replication. It was just super, super fragile. We didn't have the best database design. It was not normalized very well, so it could have been that. But the replication peer-to-peer, at least for our experience on SQL Server, it was terrible. And CouchDB worked much better. All right, so we talked about how you can have everything offline. You've got all your static assets, but now you need to store data. Again, with HTML5, you can store data pretty easy. They have local storage. So local storage is just a key value store. You give it a key, and you can put any JSON object you want in there, and it'll persist that for forever. So you can see here, it's just the local storage object, set item, that's my key. My value is going to be last name. And then to get it back, I just call getItem, and I can get it back. So you can go and, as they're updating data, you can go and save it. The problem is it's going to be there cached in that client, and it's only there. I guess technically you could have JavaScript running. It's going to check for a signal. It's going to go and read your local store and kind of write it up or sync it. That's difficult to do. Synchronization is one of those things that seems trivial when you try to implement yourself, but you quickly find all these edge cases, which makes it really difficult. The other sister of local storage is session storage. It's really similar. The difference is that it expires whenever you close your browser window. You lose whatever's been written to the session store, so it's only persistent for that session. There also are other things. Another implementation is WebSQL. WebSQL is basically, it's, what is it? It's the, did I write it down? It's the open source relational database that's built into some of the browsers. Firefox already never implemented it, but it gives you a full relational database built right into the browser. You can create tables, you can query them, you can join them, you can go and persist them. Firefox decided they weren't going to implement it, and it's actually been deprecated. So Chrome will still support it, Safari will still support it, but if you want to go and store data in a database behind your browser, it's not probably the best solution for you. But you can see it's just similar to other database code. You open in your database connection, you execute a statement, and that's it. It's kind of nice from that point of view, but not a recommended or a good solution. The solution that all the databases are going to support as standard is called IndexedDB. IndexedDB is just, again, it's just an object store. It's really similar to CouchDB, where you're just putting JSON in there and it comes back out. Here you can see how you do it. You open up a transaction, open up your store, execute a put, and you just put that in there. So it's a document store. Once again, you still have the problem that it's an isolated store. It's cached in that current client, and you're not going to get that data anywhere else. So what PouchDB does is it takes the Couch API with the master-master synchronization, the same concept of put and get, and wraps it around your built-in storage in your browser. You could also kind of think of it as almost a polyfill for browser storage, because PouchDB prefers IndexedDB because it's the most similar, it's the most supported. If IndexedDB is not supported in your browser for any reason, it'll fall back and use WebSQL. If neither are supported, it'll actually go back and use local storage. So you can use the same API regardless of which browser you're using, and you get a unified interface that you can go and write your data to. So if you're offline, then it's easy to do. I actually like, even if you're not using any of the cool features like indexes or master-master replication or synchronization, it's just got, I think, a more simplified API. So I find it's an easier way to access and store data. So it can sync with CouchDB. There's also another database called Couchbase. Couchbase is like Memcached and CouchDB merged together. It's a little more enterprisey than CouchDB. It's got easier partitioning and cross-center data replication. They also have a new language called Nickel, which is spelled N1QL, which you can write your traditional SQL, select from where, and it'll go and compile those to mapreduces and index against a document store. One of the hardest things when you move into the document stores, I think, is the querying, because you have to write a mapreduce function to build up your indexes and do it. And it's not as verbose, not as powerful as traditional SQL is, especially if you come from a background of having SQL. It's nice to have that bridge there. So that's another thing that it can sync with is Couchbase over Sync Gateway. Okay, so this is PouchDB, how you use CouchDB. You just include your script, PouchDB min.js. You say new PouchDB to-dos. That's going to go back behind the scene, create your underlying story, your index DB, and set all that up for you. As you add indexes, it'll also add stores for all your indexes back there. To add an object, if I have my to-do object, I just say put, and then I get a callback. It also will support callbacks or promises. It will support both. And then if it's an error, I log my error, otherwise I don't. To remove, it's just db.remove, and then the object I'm going to remove. One of the things to be careful with PouchDB and CouchDB is that it keeps track of all your document revisions and versions for you. So as you make a change, it keeps the entire history. It marks that one as not the active one or the deleted one, but it keeps track of all of your changes. And that can be nice, for versioning, for auditing, to have all of that, but also can get really heavy. So one of the things you want to do frequently is to compact your database, to clean up your views. And that's going to go and remove everything except for the most recent version, so that your database doesn't grow quite so big. But the versioning is also how it uses the complex resolution. So it can say, hey, look, we both have the same parent revision. We're children. That's how I know what version I belong to. All right, so to query the database, you need to use an index. And to create an index, you create what's called a design document. A design document is just another JSON document where you have an index function in it. So you can see that my design document's ID is design my index, and inside of it I have a view that's called my index. And then I have a map function, and this map function is basically just going to emit the document.name. So it's going to take every document I've got, and it's going to give me its name. So now I can go and I can query by name, and I can get back a list of all documents that share that name. So that's how you would query there. And you can also, in PouchDB, you can just pass in a function, and it'll go and iterate every document in your store with that map function. But it's not going to make use of an index, so it's going to take forever, so it's not performant. When you put your map function in your design document, it actually creates a B-tree index, and so it'll be really performant to go and look that up. So that's just really the only way to do it, even though the documentation is not quite as good on that because it's one of the newer features. Is that messed up there too? Is that better? There you go, eventual consistency. All right, so this is how you're going to go and query my index. So I call pouch, which is the database, and query, and then the name of the index. And then here you can say I have a start key, an end key. The end key's also got the largest Unicode character you can. So that's going to go, it's going to go through the B tree and find the first document that starts with P. And then it's going to go and find the last document that ends with P. Limit's going to say only give me back 5 documents, and then include docs is going to give me the entire JSON document. If I didn't do that, it would just give me back the index value and then the document key. So you can have it return just the key, or you can have it return the whole document based on that. And then you can see the promise that's going to get handled when it comes back. I should have put this, but the result object comes back as a JSON object that gives you the number of records found, and then another object that's an array that's all the documents. So you want to go and say, result.documents, and it'll give you all your documents you can sort through. And then this is, I think, is the killer feature for both CouchDB and PouchDB. It's the two-way sync, it's the replication. So you can see I've got my local database, which is the to-dos. That's the one that's on my client. And this is the URL to my actual CouchDB. So here it's using Irish Couch, which just is a hosted couch provider. And down here, I just say db replicate to and from, and you can see that they're swapped there. The option up here of live true, that means it's going to continually monitor them for changes. I can call replicate to and from. If I don't pass them live, it'll just go and sync it once. It won't continually watch for changes. That can be important. If you have live on, it's going to keep trying to sync over and over again. One of the best features for this is like using it for like Cordova or PhoneGap, because again, you have a disconnected scenario there. But live's going to keep opening up your radio off a lot. It's going to drain your battery faster. If you're concerned about battery drain because you're doing a mobile application, it's better to have like a timer and go and call replicate yourself every 5 minutes or whatever your schedule needs to be, rather than letting it the connection stay on and sync. So there's different scenarios when you want to have live sync versus not live sync. I should segue, I also did a Cordova app, which was a team tracker. One of the guys I know knows the guy that races the Baja race. They have trucks and they race the entire peninsula down there in Baja. And you have your race vehicle, which is your $10 million vehicle, and then you have a whole bunch of chase vehicles. And the problem is that there's no cell phone access, there's no internet access. So we wrote a mobile app that runs on a tablet, and it knows how to talk to a satellite hotspot. So it could go and turn on the hotspot. We'll go satellite through really small bandwidth, and we'll say, hey, your race vehicle's over here, all your chase vehicles are over here. This is their average velocity. This is the message they sent that they broke down. So it's, it's not that neat. We have that on, like latitude or sharing your thing. It's the whole point of it is that it's small bandwidth and can go over a satellite radio. And again, it's occasionally connected scenario. So as an example, we used it outside of the CS scenario. One of the things with synchronization is you have to make sure you enable CORS. CORS is, what is it, cross-origin S something. What is it? There you go, cross-origin resource support. So because your CouchDB is like a web server, if you have your website on a different domain or different port, it's not going to be able to sync, it's not going to be able to call back. It's easy to enable CORS. They actually have a script for you. You can just do npm install, add CORS to CouchDB, and then invoke that script, and it'll go and set up your CORS configuration for you so your websites can actually talk to your CouchDB instance. All right, so we have syncing going back and forth. We need to know when data has changed so we can go and update it. Let's say you have a result set there or some sort of information. The changes API will go and it'll raise an event for you anytime it receives a change. Whether data's been added, modified, or deleted, it'll go and fire that event. You can see the period since, from now, how long has everything changed. I could also say, starting from an hour ago, give me all of the changes up to now. So you can time box that. Live is going to, again, continuously look for changes and continue to fire events. If you just call it once without live, it's just going to give you all the changes currently and then stop monitoring for changes. The other events that changes fires as well as fires complete lets you know that you're completely synced up. There was an error syncing, a record was created, a record was updated, a record was deleted. So given that, you can know when your remote has updated. I talked a little about conflicts before. You can query conflicts, get all the conflicts that are there. There's also plugins called like Delta Pouch. If you use Delta Pouch, that's the one that's going to go and say, let me do a merge on the conflict. So if first name's changed on one record, last name changed on the other, the result's going to be the change of each. It's going to be merged together. This was Couchbase, what we were using there. Couchbase is super performant. It keeps almost everything in RAM. So you have data stacks or MongoDB. It's really high throughput. So that's what we were using there more than CouchDB. Alrighty, this is demo time. And I'm just going to apologize that my demo is in CoffeeScript. If you're not familiar with CoffeeScript, those two functions are the same. You have CoffeeScript supports lambdas and maps of the functions. I think everything else is pretty easy to read, but I think if you haven't seen CoffeeScript, that can throw people for the first time. Oh no, not beach ball of death. I don't know what's going on. What? Tab closed and the other open. All right, there we go. So this is just a simple team administration page for my racing application. It's in Angular. It's ng grid right there. If I can just pull up another window. Right, so here's my CouchDB instance. See here are all my documents. Over here are the different views. You can see the different design documents. So here's a view which is a team by name and password. It's going to give me all the documents that are a team type. And then the index is the username and passwords. So when you go to log it, oh, sorry. Yes, I think I can. I think I just zoom like this, right? Is that a little better? All right. So when I go to log in, I can search for the username given, the password given. I can see if that one matches. I can show you the design document over here, where you can see all of my conflicts I've got in the system, so I can manually resolve them. And then up here are my design documents. So here's my team design document. And you can see that there are the map functions for that different document. There it goes. So I have two different instances. This is running in incognito mode, so they're simulating completely different browsers. They don't have different caches, different databases, different stores. They're not sharing anything. I can add a team onto one, and it'll just show up automatically on the other, because they will sync. And then I also can come over to CouchDB, and that same document will show up over on in the database over here. So any change that happens anywhere, whether it happens in the database, I've got I don't know, any sort of application that's right into the CouchDB store will show up there. It'll also show up. If I were to, I can't really simulate it here, but if you were to unplug your network, make changes in your offline app, plug it back in, it's going to go and say, hey, this is what happened when I was offline, what happened when you were offline. All your data is going to sync back up. So you can have data-intensive applications that are going to communicate back and forth in occasionally connected scenarios. When you combine that with the HTML application cache, HTML5 application cache, it makes for a killer scenario where you can have your websites work whether you have data or not, your internet connectivity or not. And that's, I think, pretty much it. Questions? Yes, sir.
So you use the changes that they have here?
Oh, yeah. I guess I should show some code, huh? I can actually show you that code there down here in WebStorm. I planned on showing code, but, you know, you get nervous up here. So here's what I call my pouch, or it's setting up my database for me. It's got to be bigger again. Oh. Is that good? So you can see I'm just creating my new pouch instance. I'm using local storage just for things that I'm actually want stored locally and not syncing. Because I missed a slide too. Anybody skipped over it? There's also a way you can filter. You can filter when you're synchronization. You can filter only given doc IDs, or you can write like a view that says only sync documents that meet this criteria. In a case where you have a large CouchDB store, you know it's going to be several gigabytes long. You don't want that syncing to every client out there. Instead, what you probably want is you want to write a filter that says when they log in, only sync this user's information or documents that are pertinent to them. And it'll filter your synchronization so only things related to that client go there instead of back and forth. I think that was on the slide. I skipped over that. So that's what you would do. So down here you can see I actually have it commented out. That was my replication filter, and then I pass in the team ID. So it's only going to give that team's information and not make it all public everywhere. I missed that part before. Good thing I here. And then down here you can see the events here. So I have it set up so when it changes, I go and I'm grabbing the document type and then the change. So my event that fires is going to be team.deleted, team.updated, race vehicle .changed. So I can see what channel it was and also what the activity was on that. And then over here on my team admin page. I just am subscribing to that event and then going and updating the grid. So that's right here. code. And any other questions? Yes, sir. It's HTTP and they're using polling. I think that, yeah, I think they're planning on using WebSockets. I don't think that's there yet. Any other questions? All right, we'll call it good.
Real quick, is anyone planning on doing a lightning talk? If so, come over here. We'll have you talk to Brandon, and he'll get you hooked up as a presenter on the Adobe Connect session. Is there anyone out there planning on doing a lightning talk? Okay, maybe. Well, that might actually work out okay then. All right. Yeah, you do? Okay. Go talk to Brandon.
Let me get this adjusted. Can everybody hear me okay? You hear me just fine? I don't want anybody falling asleep when I'm doing this. So there's still plenty of food back there. Make sure you get something to eat, something to drink. Just don't walk out the back door if you can help it. So I'll go ahead and get started. Be talking tonight about harnessing the power of ng model and ng form. And make sure that my screen's working. There we go. It's a love story. I love ng model and ng form. It's one of the most powerful directives in Angular, but we take it for granted. Why do I have any business being up here on the stage at all tonight? This is a little bit about me. I've been doing web development for about 15 years. I'm actually a University of Utah graduate in computer engineering, but I'm a big BYU fan. That's just the way it goes. I actually worked at the University of Utah for 10 years as well after I graduated. I don't know how that works, but I'm a principal front-end engineer at AtTask. If you would have told me, I grew up in American Fork, if you would have told me growing up that I would be working at the point of the mountain, it meant something completely different when I was growing up, because the only thing around was the prison. So, you know, if my teacher said, someday you're going to end up at the point of the mountain, they wouldn't have known it would be the awesome place that is the Silicon Slopes here. So it's a great place here, Adobe, AtTask, a variety of businesses around here. Vivint Solar. My passions are clean code. I know clean code's subjective, but I love it. I love beautiful code when I see it. AngularJS and JavaScript is a huge passion of mine right now. I did a lot of back-end development. I'm doing a lot of front-end development now. It's a great challenge. It's a new challenge. And I love testing. TDD is a big passion of mine as well. So why would I want to talk about ng model? ng model is, by the way, does anybody recognize the picture? Anyone? Okay, I got some nods in the back, yep. I love this picture, one of my favorite pictures. You know, this is Napoleon Dynamite's girlfriend from Oklahoma, supposedly, that he took to photogenics or something. Anyway, so why would I want to talk about ng model tonight? ng model is a tag that we probably think of as just like window dressing in Angular now. You use it just about anywhere. It's one of the first directives that you would have used probably in your first piece of code. It's very powerful and we ignore it. There's a lot of things that we do that it could be leveraging for us instead. Who's used in their code ng blur or ng focus? Who's ever used one of those directives before? Come on, it's okay. If you've used them, it's cool. What about ng change? Yeah? Have you ever used ng blur, ng focus, or ng change to do some kind of form validation? Validate a field. Okay? Those are places where we could use ng model by itself. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do that tonight. So the stuff I'm going to go over tonight is applicable for basically every version of Angular. We were talking about how the ng model directive has been around since version 1.0 of Angular. Most of the features that are in ng model today have been around that entire time. Some of the things I talk about later, like the set pristine method, has only been around as of version 1.2. There's some newer features in 1.3. I won't be touching on the 1.3, the newest features, because there's a lot more there. But everything I talk about tonight, you should be able to use in nearly every version of Angular. So here's some of the basic features of NGModel. This first example here is probably something that you've written a number of times. You probably saw on the Angular homepage itself. Is the font large enough? Everybody can see it okay on the screens? Looking good? Okay. So the most basic piece of code here, text input demo, strapping an NGModel to a text input field, putting an ng app on a body or a div, and then having a bind template that just renders that value out. We've done this. This is, the hello world of Angular, basically. So we think of that, well, okay, it does some data binding for us. That's great. Two-way data binding is one of the biggest things with Angular. It does a little bit more for us, too. So let's look at conversion. This is a little bit more complex demo, not much more so. What we have is a little addition demo, and I actually have the demo repeated twice here. Once using input text fields. We'll just look at the demo up here, so get this one out of the way. The only thing to know in my JavaScript right now is I basically set up a controller that initializes 2 arguments, and then I've added a type of filter so I can print out this nice little type of each of the model values next to each of them. That's all the filter does for me. So let me get that out of the way. First thing is using input text. So we have our text input fields where we can make changes. The idea here is we have some bind templates where we have argument 1 plus argument 2 printed out, and then we evaluate them using a bind template. We then have our input text fields, and we have the type of each argument printed out next to them. And then we have the same thing down here with the same controller, but we have a type of number instead, input type number. So let's see how this works. So should be able to add these values together. Let's see, we're getting 1 plus 2 equals 3. Notice the data type next to them, their type of number. Let's put a 2 next to it. And we get 122, which of course is 12 plus 2, right? I mean, that's 122. Notice the type changed to string. And we can fix it. Let's erase that out. And oh, great, now we get 12, and we can do all sorts of stuff. It turned it into concatenation instead because it changed the type of the value in the model. So it's doing a little bit of data conversion for us. Let's see these input type numbers down here and see what it does. So let's see, we did 12 plus 2, and of course that looks a lot better, makes a lot more sense. 12 plus 2 is 14, and we can see that the type of the value also stayed as number. So Angular is has some smarts in it as well, that it's doing some data conversion for us depending on the type of the input field that we're using. So data conversion can be done with NGModel. And this is just built-in features at this point. It also does validation. So here's a really simple validation example. Input type text. I would never put my password in an input text field. It would usually be password, but it's a lot easier to demonstrate if you can actually see the password up here. So we have a couple of validation fields on the input text. One is ngmin length and one's ngmax length. And let's notice what it does here with validation. So as long as we keep our password longer than 4 characters, we can see the model value being rendered here. As soon as we go to shorter than 4, it disappears. Actually, the ngModel behind the scene, or the model behind the scenes, is undefined. That's part of the validation rules in Angular. If we go back up to 4 or more, we're getting that. If we extend this out to more than 12, we end up with the same thing where we get undefined. So it provides some validation built in with Angular that we can also extend if we want to in our own code. So those are some of the basic features. Additionally, it provides validation state as well. And I assume that a lot of these features I'm going over so far you have already used in your code, but it's to provide a foundation for where we're going to go for some extension. So let's look at validation. I have a simple field here. Let's look at my JavaScript, just quick overview of this JavaScript. All it's doing is that there's some CSS state classes that Angular will put on each of your fields depending on the dirty state, pristine state, and the valid state of the various validators that you might have on the input field. The directive is simply adding those classes there so we can just see them as we change the field. So I'm going to get that out of the way. Additionally, just the CSS is just here just to style it with some red and green. I apologize if any of you are colorblind. You'll just have to trust me that it's changing to the correct colors. Anyway, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'll show you the code because this is where we get the most value here. So right now, we have an input value of change me, and you can see that it's pristine, which means no changes have happened on this input field, and it's valid, which means it's currently passing all the validators that are on the page. The validators that we have here is we have a required one, and we have a min length of 3. So we would expect these values to change as we manipulate the value. As soon as I get rid of the E, we can see that it's changed. Now it's got an NG dirty on it instead of NG pristine, which means the field has been manipulated. Important thing to note with dirty and pristine on your NG model, you may have run into this issue before, is it only compares with the previous value that you've changed it to, and we'll look at the pipeline in just a minute to show why it does that. But if I change it back to change me, notice it's still dirty, because it's simply comparing it to the previous value, not the initialized value. If I go down below, I'm still at 3. If we go down below 3, you can see that it invalidates, and you can see how these different classes change. It's got an overall NG valid that will be provided, so you can style based on that, but then it also tells you specifically which type of validation is valid or invalid. We can still see required is valid, min length is invalid. The CSS classes, of course, are limiting in and of themselves. Number one, the classes on the input element or the select element, whichever element that you are doing the NG model on. And of course, replaceable elements don't allow us to do stuff like before or after content and other things like that. So there's not a lot we can do to, say, disable our form until they've correctly entered everything or everything's in a valid state on the form, other things like that. So there's additional things that we need to be able to get to. The key to all this is NG model controller and NG form controller. Angular is really well engineered, and really NG model and NG form, those two directives are doing nothing more than exposing these controllers, registering them on our forms. NG model controller is doing a couple things. It's registering the NG model controller on our element, and it's also adding event listeners to that field to determine when it should trigger a view value update. Form is doing nothing more than aggregating against all of its child NG model and NG form elements and registering those so it can give an aggregate overall validity state of the form. So let's get a sense of how these things work together. We talk about two-way data binding like it's some magical thing where things just come together, you know, they talk in the middle, have a little conversation to decide who's right, and that's how it happens. But it's actually two different pipelines happening. There's a view to the model flow, and there's a model to view flow that's going on, this synchronization. It has to happen in two different channels. So let's talk about view to model first. A way that your NG model works with its NG model controllers, first of all, it's called the $setViewValue method, primarily with a string. It could be any object type, but usually all the input elements that we have on our form are sending strings in. How is this triggered? It's usually by some kind of browser input event. Like I mentioned earlier, NG model directive registers event listeners on the input elements. You can imagine on an input text element it's registering a key down or an input event element that would trigger this set view value. What this method does is it compares it to $view value. $view value is the internal representation of the view value. It's the last value that it received, triggered through the browser. If the values are different, then it updates its internal representation. It updates the dirty state. Notice we were looking at those CSS classes earlier, the pristine and dirty. It's updating those. And it's updating the classes. It then sends the values straight over to the model, but first it takes a little detour through some things called parsers. $parsers is an array of various transformative parsers that it'll run through to modify the data and update it. Primary responsibilities being transforming the data, validating the data, and updating the validation state. We've looked at some of those already built-in ones that we have in terms of transforming the data, looking at the number data type, and also validation happening through like ng min length and required. It goes through these in order. Order matters when you're working with something that might transform data where it's piping that data from one piece to the next piece. So you can imagine how those have to happen in order. Once it goes through the parsers that are registered, it compares it to dollar model value. Like dollar view value, this is the internal representation of the model. It's the last one that it received. If it's different, getting through all these, then it updates the model, the ng model argument on your directive. It updates that expression, that value, with the updated value. It updates its internal representation, and then it calls view change listeners. Dollar view change listeners is an array, but actually you've probably used this before. If you use the ng change directive, that's just simply adding a change, something to this view change listener array that's called at the end. That's why you have to be real careful when using ng change, because if your value is in an invalid state, when it gets to this point, it won't actually trigger your view change listener or your ng change expression. Very important. That's how it goes through in that way. The other way is a little bit simpler. So let's go through it just briefly. We're going to look at stuff that's a little more familiar to us in Angular. One of them is the watch expression, of course. So it registers a scope $watch on your model expression that you gave it. When that value changes, it's going to update its internal representation. It already knows it's changed because that's what watch does for us, right? It detects changes. So it updates it, sends it straight over to the view. Just like the parsers going in, we have formatters going out, and that has the same responsibilities as the other one, to transform the data, to validate it if need be. Usually you're not validating data going out, but sometimes you'd have to. And then also updating validation state accordingly. Once it gets to the view, oh, and by the way, these run in reverse order, so just like it shows on the slide there, they're running the other direction. Once it gets to the view, it compares it with its internal representation, and if the value is different, then it knows it needs to update the browser to reflect this new view value. So it updates its internal representation and calls a function called render, $render. $render's responsibility, and this is usually something you write when you write custom components, its responsibility is to make sure that the browser screen, the client's screen, reflects what the view value is. So you can imagine something like an input text element. It's calling element.val. If you're using JQLite or jQuery, it's calling the equivalent of that to set that input field to what came out the end of these formatters. Make sense? This is all of it together. There's a lot of pieces in here, and 1.3 does add a couple of more things, and I encourage you to go look at that later, where you can actually register validators in a separate channel. There's a way to do, oh wow, I'm getting all sorts of different messages. I thought I turned off my push bullet, but I'm going to snooze that really quick. Oh, that's cool. I'm getting all sorts of LinkedIn notifications. All right. Cool. I'll have some jobs to look at later or something. LinkedIn is great. All right. So there's a lot of different things going on here. 1.3 adds even more. Let's look at what our plugin points are that are available to us where we can leverage ngModel. One of them, of course, $parsers to be able to transform and validate data coming in. Another one is the formatters going out, and then we also have the view change listeners. Just because ng change only allows us to register one view change listener doesn't mean we couldn't register our own. So we have some plugin points available to us. There's a few ways that we can already get to ngModel controller, and then we'll look at extending it. This is the easy way to do it. Before we looked at CSS classes, and they were kind of limiting. We can't really change the state of our form based on a CSS class by itself. We can visually disable things and make them look invalid, but we can't really change the workflow. This is how they provide us in Angular. You add a name attribute to your form element or a value to your ng form attribute. What this does is it names the form and it exposes a variable on your scope named that value. So if our form name was form, then there would be a scope.form on there that would expose the validation state of the form. We, of course, want to add a noValidate attribute to form elements. This is an HTML5 attribute. It's available, and if you don't do that, then the browser's built-in validation will happen with things like required and your various input types. It's usually an undesirable effect because you've probably taken great pains to style the other way to look really nice. And then also you add name attributes to all your input elements that you want to be exposed to this registering with the ng form. You can't use the ID. I know we use IDs with stuff like labels, but you have to use the name. That's the one that it registers with. Let's look at a quick example of what this looks like. So here I have a little customer registration form. It lists customers down here, registers somebody, it adds them to a list. blanks out my field. This is a really simple controller over here that does that functionality. Just basically pushes the list. The more interesting stuff, at least in this one, is the markup. So let's look at it. So we have our validation here, entering a first name and last name. Very much like before, we have on our first name, we've added required, which is the required field. So as soon as I put that in, it removes that field, and this is in a known state. I've actually added a message next to each of these, and the way that you do that, you can see this customer form first name $invalid on an ng show. Where am I getting this customer form first name from? Well, what it does is it takes the name. By putting a name on my form, it registered a scope variable with that value in it. It then, any input elements that have a name on them, it registers them under that collection as a value too. So you can see a name, a first name on there. It then provides me various state values for that element that I can use here. I can actually use them inside my controller if I want as well. I'm just using them to show and hide messages. Last name's the same thing. You can see it's got actually two error validators on it, required and ng-min length. I've got two different methods. The validation state not only provides a $invalid, $valid, $dirty, $pristine, but it also provides an error hash where the values will be truthy if there's an error in that type, and they'll be falsy if there isn't. So we can see here as I change the last name, SM, it still needs to be at least 3 characters long, so if I go here, it's valid. The other thing that's really cool that you can do with these validation state things is I have my button here, but notice I'm sitting here hitting enter. I can click it. It's not adding them. That's because there's the overarching forms state that I can use, and the ng submit just accepts the expression, so I can say, well, I only want to be able to submit when customer form is valid, and then do the add function. So I can do that. I could even take something like this customer. I can take this customer button and ng disabled equals. You could go customer form dot invalid. So we could actually visually show this as invalid until, you know, it's still invalid, and then you can see it turns on as soon as it's valid. So there's a lot of things we can do just by simply exposing the controller state to our page. Let's leave that page. Okay. Let's go to the next one here. One of the things that's kind of a gotcha is there. Okay. One of the things that's kind of a gotcha with ng form and how you do these is with HTML, of course, you can't nest forms. With Angular, you can using the ng form directive. And it's actually necessary in a couple of key instances. Let me show you here. We'll get the JavaScript and the CSS out of the way here. It's just really a collection here. I just want to collect their name and their 3 favorite ice cream flavors. So we've initialized that with a controller, and the CSS is just to show various colors based on state. So we can see here, let's see, John Doe, the name has a required thing on it, so if I remove the name, you can see it's invalid, and it also shows the overall form is invalid. Just a thin thing there. John, put that back. So it's all valid. Now these 3 favorite ice cream colors, you can see here I have the field. I'm just repeating through input fields, and then I'm showing an invalid message if they're invalid. So what I would expect is the field would be red, the overall form would be red, and I would have a little message here that says invalid next to the field. So let's see if that works. So let me just get rid of that. We have red, the overall form's red, but I don't have any message. That's kind of strange. What about this one? Same thing. All right, let's get rid of vanilla. Now they're all invalid. I don't know if anybody knows what's going on there, but basically what's happening is it's exposing, each one of these instances has an ng model controller attached to it, right? They each have an ng model, so they have an instance of ng controller. What we don't have, though, is we don't have the state for each one of these exposed properly on the field. If you look here, we have our example. This is how we're showing the message. We have example matching the form. We have flavor, which matches this field. But notice that that value is being overwritten every time in. So if you think about it, the validation state is being overwritten for each row, and the last row wins. So the first row, it's example.flavor is the validation of state of this, then it's this one, and then finally this one. So whichever one happened last, whatever it does, will be what the invalid value is. So how do we fix this type of issue? It's actually really simple. We can nest forms. So this is a real easy and practical example of using this. So let's just call it, I don't know, icy because it's short and it's ice cream. So we'll add a form here, and then we'll reference that form instead here. So this is the state of this nested form. Flavor invalid, and let's see if that works instead. Okay, we can see the validation state's correct, which was done by a CSS, and we can remove these. We can add one in. We can change them independently, and the value changes inside. It turns out that nesting forms can be a really nice way to take sections of a form and get the overall validation state of that individual section. It's really, really useful, because notice as soon as we take that one out, even though we've got a nested form, it still propagates up to our root form and lets us know that the entire form is invalid. I just wanted to show briefly a couple of custom components. Sometimes built-in components aren't enough and you need to be able to extend them. Just want to show you a couple things you can do here to leverage the ng model controller in your own components. So this one is a ROT13 transformer. Have you ever heard of ROT13 before? It's like the dumbest encryption ever. It basically rotates the alphabet 13 characters, and that's the value. I mean, again, I wouldn't use it to do any serious encryption, but it's great for a demo. So what I have here in the code on the right is I have a little well, actually, let's look at the markup. So I have an input here, and it has the input value, and I have this JL-ROT. That's my directive. I'm then going to take and print out the model value, and then I'm going to print it out using a ROT13 filter that I also have. So if I type something like bacon, you can see bacon, it's been ROT13 encoded, and then it's also been decoded by a filter that I put on it, and you can add stuff to it. Exclamation points, it's not specific on what you do with those, so it just changes letters. So let's look at what we do here to add our own validator and converter. So I've got a directive here. The directives are the key way to do this. So you add a directive. One thing you have to do is you have to require ng model. This is saying I need to use the ng model controller that's attached to this element. How is the ng model attached to that element? Well, with most input fields, we already have an ng-JASK model. This allows us to access this controller that's available there. When you have the link function, there's a fourth argument that you get on the link function when you write your directives and you require a controller. It's either a single element that represents the controller, or if you had an array of requires here, it would be an array of controllers that you need to be able to leverage in your directive. From that, we actually attach to the parsers and formatters on that controller. You remember in our diagram that we had $parsers and $formatters. We can simply push our own method on there and have it participate in the pipeline. The method here I have is real simple. It's a convert element. It takes the value that it received. And the rule is with any of these parsers and formatters is if the value is valid, it returns the actual value or the original value. If it's invalid, it should return undefined. If you remember in the password example I showed, if the value was less than 3 characters or greater than 12, it set it as an empty string. Or it was actually setting it as undefined. That's what it's doing there. So I'm just returning the original value if it's empty. Otherwise, I'm leveraging a little ROT13 service that I have in here that my filter as well as my directive uses. This is actually a really good example of composing your components together so that I can leverage this service both as a filter here as well as inside my directive. So yeah, you can push on the parser pipeline and on the formatters, and you can just add your elements that way. The easiest way to do that is just by adding your own directive. This is kind of a fun one here. This is another one. This one's just doing validation. So let's get that one out of the way. Wish that these would split up better. There we go. Okay. Still puts it 2/3. I want them half and half. There we go. Okay. So I have a little Battleship. Imagine you're making Battleship in Angular. I don't know that I ever would, but somebody's done 2048, so why not this? If I add an element, if it's a valid value, then you can see it's not read anymore, and I can fire, and it puts a little element here, and then I can put E4. Well, what we've done here on this element, I have an @coordinate validator, and all that's doing, again, it's very similar to the other one where my validator, it's a directive, it requires ngModel, and you add your validator to your parser and formatter. The reason you would add it to a parser and a formatter is perhaps your model data that you're getting from the server or from your service is invalid as well. You don't necessarily know all the data flow through your application, so it is pretty valuable to add your validators to both parts of the pipeline. So that's kind of just a fun little demo. This one's another one. This one actually does, it's a completely custom component. So this one here, you have binary value of 6, and if I flip bits, I can, change the value here. And this is just a set of span elements with click elements on them. So you can see the directive here. Basically, with your custom component, you can do anything you can normally do in a directive. So you require ngModel, and you allow ngModel to manage your validation state, and you add any kind of custom parsers and formatters to it, but then you render your own custom elements. You can see here I'm creating a little template where I'm using ngClick. Basically, it flips that bit on each one. But down here at the end, all I'm doing is I have a parser that's parsing the value. So it actually parses an array of bits, and then it uses the binary to-string thing to actually convert those into, or sorry, it's a parse int with a base 2 on it to convert them back to a integer value here and back and forth. But you can put those parsers and formatters on there. They have to have different values because the representation is different on the inside and outside. But then here's this render I was talking about before. Remember, if you need the render's responsibility is to set the view state. And so what it does is it basically goes through the elements that I previously created, and it properly sets the value on each bit. That's what the render's doing once it gets the value. Some interesting code to look through. It was a lot of fun to write. The last one I wanted to show just really quick, this one's really cool, is you can also use SVG. So these ones here are just simple ratings. They're using an SVG graphic in there. I don't know if you knew you could use SVG with Angular. It's XML markup, base markup, so SVG is really cool to use with these. So this one is actually writing a custom component using SVG as the rendered template here. Unfortunately, CodePen wouldn't let me put this in as a script, as a resource in the page, so I had to make this really ugly looking template. But basically all it's doing is the mouse move just tracks the element and then calls render as it makes the change through the element. And so when we do mouse move, it actually sets the view value, which will send it through that cycle through here, and then render's called, and all render does is it sets the width of this masked value. So there's just a mask over this, and it's showing just a certain amount of the SVG. I actually have all these code pens on my own code pen here. You can go to London, it's LUND0N. That's where my code pens are. You can look at my collection. I have a whole bunch of ones just on ngModel and ngForum. Really good. One of the best ways to look at custom components and how to build your own is to actually look at the Angular source. If you look at, particularly at input.js, that's where all the input text elements, input number, and et cetera are registered as directives against the controller. You can see how they build them, what event listeners they're plugging into, and how they're leveraging ngModel. Angular UI Bootstrap's really good for this as well. Their components are very well composed, and they're leveraging ngModel really well. My code pen has the examples I just showed as well as a number of other ones. And also at AtTask, we have a Fed YouTube channel. So if you just look for AtTask Fed, I have a course that I did a few months ago at AtTask on ngModel and ngForum. You're welcome to, those videos are public. You're welcome to look at those if you want further instruction. And of course, there's a number of egghead videos that will also help get you started on some of these features. Kent C. Dodds has a couple on some of the newer features like ngModel options that you may want to check out once you're kind of ready for that next level. Anyway, thanks for your time. You can follow me on Twitter or drop me an email. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. Okay, all right. So I believe we had Tanner was going to be doing a lightning talk. Do we have any others? Any other takers on a lightning talk? Okay, all right. So we'll have Tanner do that, and then we'll do some raffles, and we'll do some other closing announcements as we head out. For those of you who are heading out now, there's a basket at the front before you exit. Drop off your badges in there, and we appreciate that. Okay, come on up.
Right. So, okay, you can see that. One thing I wanted to add on to the first presentation with Pouch, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I was just kind of digging around with a lot of Pouch stuff over the weekend. And one thing I ran into is that if you're using Pouch in any kind of like mobile development environment like iOS or Android, the first thing you're going to run into probably is that you can only max your memory out by like 5 megabytes before you get a little annoying pop-up that says, hey, you know, this app is requesting more storage. And then you can really only go as high as, you know, mobile Safari or whatever browser you're using in Android or whatever your mobile browser is allowing you to use. On desktop, it's a little more lenient, but like Chrome is the most lenient. It'll pretty much assign you a percentage of your available hard drive space. But on mobile, it's not that easy. And somebody, if you go to PouchDB.com, there is a section, let's see, hold on. PouchDB FAW, no, Q. Let's see, there is a section on, right here. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. So for mobile applications, you can use, let's see, SQLite plugin right here. So there's an SQLite plugin for Cordova if you use Cordova, and I've been searching for the best way to use write an Ionic or Cordova or PhoneGap app and use PouchDB with it without really having it be known to the user that I'm using some in-memory or in-browser database. And so the SQLite plugin, you install it through Cordova, and then you set your PouchDB to use specifically you set it to specifically use the web SQL implementation of PouchDB, and it will go right towards the Cordova plugin and start using the device's built-in storage instead of the browser storage. And I've tested it up to like 500 megabytes so far, and I haven't had any problems with it. It does get slow, obviously, when querying stuff like that, but it gets rid of that problem. That was just something I wanted to add because it was the biggest headache I had over the weekend. What I really wanted to present on really quickly was, I don't know if you've always, I like to do lightning talks, if you haven't noticed, if anybody's been to other meetups, but I always like to write little directives that help me out in my day-to-day and then show them to everybody. Everybody's always run into this before, where I gotta go slower, because frame rate's bad. If you're scrolling down a page, and you hit an overflow object with scroll, and it just starts to scroll inside the box until you're done with the box, and then you keep on going. And this is fine. We use it a ton in like menus and side menus that pop up, and it's really great. But we ran into a situation where we need a dashboard, and sometimes you have widgets that need fixed heights, or any kind of div really that needs a fixed height. But you don't want the over-scroll experience for your user. It's annoying, especially when you pull up a dashboard and you're on a smaller screen. Maybe a chart is meant to be at a certain width and height, and you end up scrolling around inside of this little miniature div. It's super annoying. And so we thought about a couple of ways to fix that. We could either force the widget size to be the size of the chart or the size of the content, or we could just kind of disable it entirely and just make it really specific so that our user experience is great. But with like mobile and responsive and widgets and all this crazy stuff, all these crazy variables going around, we needed something a little more elegant. So this is kind of a little mock dashboard I put together. But these widgets right here, what they do is they're just showing some charts. They actually have something really cool that I could talk on if you guys want. That this is in Angular. I've built kind of a subgrid that relies on Bootstrap. So sure, Bootstrap is great when you're resizing the page. It says, oh, your whole window is this width. So I'm going to make all these columns wrap and change and do all this stuff. If you've worked with rows and the call small 6 and call small whatever. But that's different when you're inside of a widget because it's not going off of your widget size. It's going off of your screen size. So these widgets in here will actually respond kind of on their own level of, let's see, that one's not responsive. Hold on a sec. I think this one is. So this one, when it gets too small, it wraps inside. That's a completely different media query than the entire page. So you could actually have your own little miniature media queries per sections or per columns of your page, and it really helps out to make sure that no matter where content is positioned on a page or how big it can be, it's going to be laid out perfectly. And then the other thing too is that if this chart was actually rendered at full height, it's perfectly fine. But what happens when you get smaller widgets? This is something that we built to actually scale your content inside of your box. Instead of scrolling, instead of hiding, instead of having annoying things like that. This is just a simple directive that I actually haven't built out to be distributable yet. But you just simply pop it on your element that's got overflow, and it goes in and detects all of the space that it's going to need, takes care of your ratios, and it uses hardware accelerated CSS3 transitions and kind of scales your content down to fit your box wherever it is. And it's not for every use, obviously, but I think it's going to come in handy quite a bit for what we're doing at least. So I wanted to kind of see if anybody had any questions about that or how other people have even solved that same problem. Or if anybody had any questions. I haven't developed this into a distributable directive, like I said, but I want to if there's people that think it would be valuable. So
your images are SVG?
No, actually, there's like 10 lightning talks in this one screen, but those charts are actually Chart.js. Chart.js is canvas-based, which is really cool. They actually react to your size. All the actual filtering capabilities are homegrown, but the charting library is Chart.js. So, okay. Yeah. No, it's actually really easy. So obviously it's easy if you have some predefined conditions, right? But the hard thing about getting the, all these miniature media queries is that if divs are changing all the time, there isn't really a great way on the web to detect width and height changes for elements. There just isn't a good one built in anywhere. Obviously, you can slosh together, a jQuery watch, which would be just terrible to watch the height and width of something. Please debounce it if you do. And, you can detect some changes. And there's a couple of different libraries out there that will kind of mimic a native height and width watcher. But that's what's happening here. So inside of this widget, there is some watch going on. And right now, while I'm debugging, I am using the terrible thing that I just told you not to do. But basically, I'm just broadcasting a resize through the whole thing, and I'm resetting the class. So if you look at this class function, it's actually really simple. I've created, widget grid XS, SM, MD, and large, and I've set my own little breakpoints inside of there. So the widget itself gains a parent class of widget grid dash SM, right? And then if you look in the, let's see, grid less, and grid, widget grid right here, this is straight off of Bootstrap, or Flatstrap, if you like to use that. And I'm pretty much just saying, hey, I want to make a whole nother grid inside of these predefined classes. And it creates all of the original Bootstrap grids and breakpoints inside of your own little classes. And you just have to define your width that you want the classes to change at. So that's how that's working. Actually, I'm kind of just showing off all this dashboarding stuff. Does anybody have any questions about the dashboard? Okay. Well, if Ryan. Yeah. Yeah. I tried that out a little bit. In Zoom level, it seems to work pretty well on desktop, but on mobile, I had problems. And I don't know if that's because, mobile devices handle the Zoom property a little differently. I saw that there were some polyfills to kind of make it act regular. But even with the Zoom, I had better performance with the CSS3 transitions. Once I turned on something that forced a graphics, the GPU to start rendering it, it was really smooth. So, and I've even got the console open while I'm doing some of this stuff. So, I don't know if you've seen some of that. It's really choppy when you have the console open. Got numbers going all over the place. So, if nobody else has any other questions, I'd really like to talk to somebody who, if anybody would like to see that turned into a directive or would want to help me do it, come talk to me after.
Okay, thanks, Tanner. All right. Well, that's our meetup for today. Got a few things to wrap up with here. Wanted to remind you all, like we said, beat into your heads before we started, to register next time, assuming Adobe has us back. I've already cleared out the form, so the form that I sent earlier, you can go and register now for next time if you want. So anytime between now and the next time, a day before, just go in and put in your name, address, and if you want Wi-Fi access, which I imagine most of you do, your email, not address, sorry, your name and your email address. Also, as I said, drop off your badges at the front. As far as our queue of speakers right now, we've exhausted it. So if any of you have an idea of something you'd like to speak about next month, we would love to hear it. Reach out to us on the meetup page, and we'll get you hooked up. So we're looking for any kind of content that you guys have. We'd love to give you a chance to share it with us. Also have a raffle. That's why everyone's still here, right? This is for the raffle? Okay, all right. So we have 2 memberships to front-end masters to raffle off. And these are pretty cool, valued at about $400 a pop. So it's definitely a neat prize to get. But this is going to be a must-be present to win. So anyone watching this later hears their name and they'll kick themselves if they weren't here. Okay. All right. So we'll just start going through. Kurt Averell. Not here. Next. Matthew Wright. Okay. Jonna Flynn. All right, we got one. Okay. So we'll just have you send a message on the meetup to Matt Zabriskie. He's the head, and he'll send you your thing. And then one more. Jeremy Robertson. Okay, all right. Jonna, did I say that right? Jana. Okay, Jana and Jeremy. Okay, we got you too. How was the space? Was this good? Would you guys want to come back here? Okay, all right. So hopefully Adobe will have us back. This was kind of a trial thing, and we'll see how it goes from here. And we'll be working with Brandon, and hopefully we can meet here again. But thanks again to Adobe and to all our sponsors. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, everyone.